Hi friends, this is a response to a video that Trinket Mage made recently. In that video, he explained why he believes that green is the strongest color in Casual Commander, and then, at the end of it, he asked what other people think. Well, I disagree, and I think it's a really interesting discussion to have. So, here's what I think. In my opinion, white is the strongest color in Casual Commander. But before we have that discussion, we need to define what Casual Commander even means, which is obviously tricky since most people will have their opinion defined by their local meta, and that varies a lot. Personally, I have spent a lot of time in 3 different local communities, each of which have their own different metagame. And I also play a good amount of MTGO, which yet again has its own unique atmosphere. So there's no one definition that works for everybody. But this is what Casual Commander means to me and a lot of the people that I have played with. No fast mana, none or limited free spells, and no tutors alongside infinite combos. Most decks are also designed to have a theme instead of just being a pile of good cards, and winning is less of a priority over just hanging out and having a good time. Now, allow me to go through the arguments that Trinket Mage made in his video so that we all have proper context. I won't cover every detail though. If you want to watch the full video, I will link it below. And before I start, I want to make absolutely clear here that this isn't supposed to be some kind of attack. I just think it's a really interesting discussion and gives me an excuse to talk about a few points that I've wanted to bring up. His first point is that land ramp is firmly locked behind green. The other colors just can't ramp in the same way that green does. White has catch-up ramp, but that isn't powerful enough to compete. And the one counter to ramp decks, being mass land destruction, isn't allowed in the format, while all other kinds of sweepers, like for example those that hit mana rocks, are. Players are never forced to think, I shouldn't cast my Cultivate here because somebody might cast Armageddon. Then he continues on to explain that green has access to every kind of effect in the game, with the only downside being that they have to be attached to creatures. For example, Apex Ultisaur can act as a board wipe, Bane of Progress clears out enchantments and artifacts, and Scavenging Ooze is great graveyard hate. Finally, he discusses green card draw and how the conditions for that card draw are easy to fulfill because they only require big creatures to be in play, which is less of a condition and more of something that green wants to do anyways. Green can easily utilize these factors because Commander's social contract allows players to spend the first 6 turns of the game ramping before repeatedly going into game-ending threats. And that's it. I hope I didn't misrepresent anything. So, let's tackle this then. It's a funny coincidence that the timing lined up like this, but just a few days ago I released a video talking about ramping in white, and how it's just as good as anything green can do. If you haven't seen that video, then I assume what I just said seems insane. But catch-up ramp isn't just a gimmick that helps you keep up. It can also be used to build massive leads. For example, we can play a Lotus Veil on turn 3, sacrificing 2 lands, to then play a Claim Jumper, ramping 2 lands back into play, giving us 6 mana on turn 4 while also having a 3/3 creature with Vigilance. We can also reanimate lands, ideally fetch lands, with cards like Redemption Choir while applying pressure. Or, a very clever line a viewer suggested was using Cosmic Intervention with fetch lands, cracking the land before our end step, which returns it to play in our end step, but Cosmic Intervention lasts until end of turn, meaning we can sacrifice the fetch land again, and it will then return in the following end step, letting us use a single fetch land 3 times. Yes, the lines in white aren't as obvious as just playing Cultivate, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. While ramping in white requires more complex pieces, it also offers more utility, as cards like Cosmic Intervention, Sun Titan and Brought Back aren't limited to only ramping. And this is all in addition to using catch-up ramp to keep up with the green player. If it comes to ramp, I think green and white are equals. They are both excellent. That then brings us to sweepers. I don't think that MLD is actually a good response to ramping. Let's say, hypothetically, we have a Cultivate in hand and the mana to cast it. Opposite to us is sitting a player who we know will cast Armageddon next turn. They have announced their plan, they have shown us the card in hand, nobody can interact with it, and Spice 8 Rack is standing behind them, screaming that they will be tied to a Goblin Grenade if they don't cast this Armageddon. Armageddon will be cast the following turn. So let me ask you this. Would you play this cultivate? Now, I can't speak for you, but I definitely would, because searching out a land to add into my hand is crucial in this situation to make sure I continue hitting land drops afterwards. But let's be fair, cultivate is a bad example because it has that additional utility. The decision would be different for something like rampant growth, and Armageddon could act as a deterrent for those kinds of spells. However, I actually feel like that's going in the fundamentally wrong direction. A deck centered around ramping probably plays a lot of lands, which means they are likely more capable of handling a blind Armageddon than other decks. MLD is not the correct response to ramp. Tutor hate is. Cards like Aven Mind Sensor or Position Agent, Stranglehold or Ashiok Dream Render stop players from ramping in the first place. There's even direct ramp hate like Deep Gnome Terramancer or Confounding Conundrum, which often completely ruin the day of green players. And I say that as a green player. I find it very strange that mass land destruction is often brought up as the potential solution to powerful ramp decks, when cards like Leonin Arbiter do a much better job and don't extend the game by 10 hours. This is ultimately the problem with MLD. People don't want to play against it because it feels disrespectful to their time. Commander games have to end eventually, and playing MLD without a way to actually close out the match just puts it into this awkward state where nobody can do anything and the rest of what happened didn't matter. It's similar to why a lot of people dislike combo. It can feel like it invalidates the rest of the match. On the other hand, when I've played and seen other people play Tudor Hate, that's fine. It doesn't make players more upset than any other kind of control piece, while managing ramp much better than MLD does. I also think it's worth mentioning that when I've seen MLD actually end the game, people tend to be okay with it as well. It's not different from an overrun. That then brings us to the argument that green can do everything so long as it's attached to a creature. And while I agree that green has lots of very powerful and impactful creatures, it just can't actually do everything. It doesn't have proper board vibes. Sorry, Apex Ultisaur is just not a proper sweeper. Azuri's predation gets closer, but is still quite limited. It also doesn't have counterspells, great stacks, or strong aggressive instant speed interaction apart from specifically Beast Within. Green is a very momentum-based color. Spending a lot of mana on expensive creatures and needing those creatures to have access to their best card draw is a real limitation and shouldn't be so easily dismissed. Now let me be clear here. You should leave a thumbs up on the video. I'm also not saying that green is bad. I love green. It's my favorite color. I actually just won our most recent budget tournament with a mono green deck. I believe that green is very, very powerful, and I agree that the social contract and high life total of Commander help green succeed. But I also firmly believe that white is better. We already talked about ramping in white. I agree that ramping is very important in Commander, and white can do it just as well as green. But what, in my opinion, is actually the strongest type of card in casual Commander isn't ramp. It's Planar Cleansing. Planar Cleansing is a 6-mana sorcery that simply says, destroy all non-land permanents. There are many iterations of this kind of effect, and Planar Cleansing is honestly one of the weaker ones. Hour of Revelation, Devastating Mastery, Undo Inversion, and of course, Farewell. These are the cards that will completely destroy most casual Commander decks while not being outside of the scope that we defined at the beginning. I can't tell you how many games I've had where I ramped in the early game, stalled with my spirited companions and helpful hunters, let everybody else build up their engines, waited for my opportunity, and then hit them with an Hour of Revelation, only for the game to be basically over on the spot. Most casual Commander decks just can't recover from that level of removal. And since we are the one playing it, we have the knowledge that it's coming. We can play around it and put ourselves into an unbeatable position, especially when considering that white has access to mass reanimation. We can blow up our board and just bring it back. I used to play these cards a lot, but then I stopped because they were just too easy to win with. Much easier than any of my stupid green ramping decks. A big part of that was also because white has access to the best removal, stacks, and pillow fort. There are so many amazing cards that white has access to, but many players choose not to play because they would just dominate the game. Dranath Magistrate, Rest in Peace, and Archon of Emeria are devastating against many decks, basically taking them completely out of the game, and Ghostly Prison usually saves between 100 and infinity life per game. Even leaving Oppression behind, I can endlessly list incredibly powerful cards that many players opt out of because they're just too good, too easy. Like for example, Smothering Tithe, Teferi's Protection, Akroma's Will, and Trouble in Pairs. And should somebody actually play these, well, they very quickly take over a game. To go back to green really quick, green has amazing card draw. But as mentioned in Trinket's video, it demands prerequisites. A creature has to be in play or enter, or an expensive spell has to be cast. It's not independent and allows for counterplay from opponents. A creature can be removed in response to Return of the Wildspeaker, or Momentous Fall can be countered after the creature has already been sacrificed. Now, I don't want to engage too much in this counterplay line of thinking, because then we might say that one could cast Heroic Intervention in response to Undo Inversion, but then I counterspell you and now we're just playing Yu-Gi-Oh! In our minds. My point here is that I appreciate green card draw, and I think green is good at drawing cards, but it's conditional card draw. And here, yet again, I think white is on at least the same level. Yes, some of it is also conditional, like the white weenie draw, but there are also some really nice cards that are always good, like Wedding Ring and Smuggler's Share. White card draw doesn't manifest as the huge bursts, but instead as small incremental advantages. But that's fine, that works in casual. White also supports a huge range of archetypes with tokens, equipments, enchanters, flicker, life gain, flyers, small creatures, big creatures. It's just endless. It even has access to counterspells. Not a lot of them, but they do exist. Additionally, White's instant speed interaction is top-notch, being able to protect our permanents and even player life total with cards like Flair of Fortitude or Everybody Lives, sniping our permanents with every bit of removal imaginable, and even just silencing opponents to stop them from casting anything. And finally, White has really nice political cards like Duelist's Heritage or Lauren of the Third Path, which shouldn't be underestimated because they give us social leverage that just throwing a bunch of huge creatures onto the board doesn't. Commander isn't just a mechanical game, it's a social game, and white is simply a better social color than green. If green has a huge stack of lands in play, everybody can see it and knows they are a threat. But if I'm in white and I sacrificed 6 lands away and only have another 6 in play, but I actually have 14 mana, that isn't as obvious, which increases our win chances. White has so many good cards and powerful options that to me, it always feels like white is playing with a hand tied behind its back. It's intentionally limiting itself to make casual Commander an enjoyable experience. But if it wanted to, it could take over just like that. At the end of his video, Trinket Mage proposes a little experiment and invites the audience to build a green good stuff deck with a certain amount of lands, ramp, creatures, and so on. He then says that this deck would win a huge number of games at your average Commander table. And I agree with that. But I don't think this has all that much to do with green. I see a different reason for it. Most decks in Commander aren't just good stuff piles. They are thematic decks centered around ideas that aren't just solely focused on winning. Yes, if you bring a good stuff list and play it against my mono blue Reanimator deck, then you have a good chance of winning. But I wouldn't consider that particularly impressive or skillful. The same trick could be done with any color and yield similar results. Playing good stuff is just not that interesting, and from my experience, isn't something that most Commander players pursue. But if we are just bringing good stuff decks of all colors, then I would bet on the white focused one. Now, all of this is assuming that we are playing under the general social contract of casual Commander. Once we move away from that and free counterspells as well as tutoring for combo lines comes into play, blue and black takes center stage. Unfortunately, in my opinion, red is the worst color in Commander. It has some very powerful cards, but it's held back by the core rules of the format, specifically the 40 starting health. Many of Commander's balancing issues, both in casual and more competitive approaches, would be alleviated if players started with, let's say, 30 instead. Then early chip damage would be much more significant. Green couldn't just sit back and ramp for 6 turns, mid-game engines wouldn't be as lucrative, and red's burn damage might apply enough pressure. I always get a little frustrated when commentators easily place blame on the players, while the systems of the game encourage and support the players' behavior. But this is a story for another time. I think you could do the same kind of breakdown I just did with white, with any color, and present it in a way that it feels the most powerful. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Since Casual Commander isn't optimized for power, you don't need to worry about what is strongest, so long as you're having fun. In fact, I think the pursuit of strong in casual is hampering quite a lot of people's ability to have fun. Some of my favorite decks are not good at all, and honestly, that makes them more enjoyable. That being said, I do stand by my opinion. White is the strongest color in casual. It has just the right mix of ramp, interaction, endgame, and sociability to succeed. Thank you very much to Trinket Mage for bringing up this discussion. I thought it was delightfully interesting and just something that I wanted to talk about. I also am very interested to hear your opinion. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Do you think I'm very foolish for not just saying that green is best? I would be very interested in hearing the audience's perspective as well. And maybe now it's somebody else's turn to respond to me. No, don't worry about it. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Would definitely appreciate that. And I'll see you guys soon.